Hi, I'm Joe Tolles. Growing up in the foster care system, working within it, and single-handedly raising 8 teens adopted from the foster care system has given me a unique view into that world. My reputation for working to keep children connected, healthy, and happy with families who love them is important to me. Who I am today is a far cry from what my circumstances might have dictated. To start, I had to navigate my own childhood hurdles to become the athlete, father, and therapist I am today. Together with child advocate specialist Renee and our guest, I will highlight the issues that impacted me on my journey, issues that are most likely impacting children and families today. Join us as we examine my first steps out of the starting blocks and into the race. Welcome back to Out of the Starting Blocks and Into the Race. How are you doing, Renee?
I am doing good. I'm excited. I'm really excited with this path that we're on with our podcast. It's been a great ride thus far. Don't think that I realized how tough it was going to be at some points, like with the recording and the editing. And yeah, but I'm excited about our conversations that we've been having. I'm excited about our guests that we've had. And it's going to be a really great opportunity for us to connect with a lot of people in the foster care system, youth in the foster care system. I think it's a great ride. It's going to be a great journey. How are you doing with all of
I
this?
have no idea. It's an interesting process in that all of the things that you just mentioned, the editing and the sort of making sure all the lighting is right and all that stuff that I hate doing. I just really like talking. But the other part is sort of bearing my soul, which, I've done before, but this is sort of an extended thing. And of course, I'm going to be talking about more intimate things as we move through this process. And each episode, I'm glad that, I didn't sort of package this as like 1 through 10, because each time we have a conversation, it reminds me of something else that maybe needs to be put in there. And so luckily we have the flexibility to do that, but it's also then time consuming and I'm a bit of a perfectionist. So I like presentation and I like making sure that people understand. But it's fun so far. I agree with you. I think our guests are adding a bit to this that sort of rounds out just from what our experience is. It just sort of gives a broader look at this. And I'm looking forward to the opportunity to create those backstage conversations where,
Yeah, those backstage
yeah,
conversations are going to be fun. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think so. I think if people really want to get involved in the sort of the nitty gritty or to ask more questions about my story or just foster care in general, I guess I hope we'll be starting those in a few weeks where people can sign up and we'll have a Zoom call and we'll just continue the talk.
Right.
But
Right.
first, we got to get past this episode 2, which was so full of good information that I can't cut any of it. So, we're airing part 2 now of that conversation, and where we left off was talking about sort of the more intricate pieces of how it feels to be raised or grow up or work in the foster care system. And then next week we'll just, I think we'll even continue that one more week, and then we'll get back into sort of my personal journey, and some of the things that happened to me, that will hopefully spark more conversation.
Right. So let's do it. Let's get into part two.
I think we should. Let's just jump right in.
Okay, sounds good, Joe.
Our guests for this episode are adoptive foster mother and family advocate Danielle Skelly and youth advisor and foster care alum Guillermo Mijero.
I think that just kind of pinpoints like a big fact about foster youth is that we crave normalcy and we
Right.
don't get that normalcy, right? So instead we look for it in different ways, right? And most of the time, what's the word I'm looking for? Most of the time we have to settle, right? So instead of a normalcy where it's like going through the front door, I'd rather come through the back door, or rather than sleeping on the subway, and that becomes the normalcy for us, right?
And then that goes back to humanity. Because like when you
Exactly.
speak that out loud to anybody, like you tell it, that's inhumane. Like we take animals off the street so they don't have to sleep out in the street. And although, but somehow this system allows kids to be treated inhumanely.
Hmm.
And not that allows, but perpetuates it. It doesn't even that it allows it. It almost creates a condition where that's the norm, right?
It's the norm for a lot of kids, right? And it's, the other piece of that is that when people do step forward and they sort of create these spaces for kids, and I'm talking about like our, perfect foster parents, they become part of that isolation process because the folks around them, neighbors, family, sometimes they don't really understand it. It's like they might admire their humanity in doing that, but they think it's absolutely crazy.
We had a judge for our last adoption of our youngest one, who's 11 now, who was also a kid of a kid we raised. They did an article about me for Mother's Day in Newsday, like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something.
Hmm.
And they interviewed and we've always taken teens, so it was always big kids. And they interviewed one of our big kids, and he talked about how he was able to punch a hole in the wall and like that was okay. And we would just like hang a picture over it. And we went to finalize their adoption 4 days after the article came out, and the judge refused to finalize our adoption without a CPS investigation because she said the article perceived my house. Why would I remove a child from a chaotic environment and place them in another unhealthy, chaotic
Oh my
environment?
gosh.
And
Missing
yeah,
the point completely.
completely. And yeah,
Ah,
and she refused to finalize adoption. We went through a 90-day CPS investigation, had to hire a very expensive attorney and go through all of these loops because our house was too normal, I guess, for a baby.
yeah, I'm conflicted with that. Because I know you, right? It's like, but that, you know, it, I think often, many times, those stories don't get to, like, those stories are happening and not in a safe space because what your big kid was saying is like, you know, I feel comfortable enough to, this is my family. They're going to accept me no matter what, right? This is my family. They're going to accept me no matter what. They're going to work around it. But how many judges don't hear the reality? Certainly in my case, we were before even judges. I mean, there was a transition. I don't even know how old I was before we had to appear in court. But there was a lot of information that was not shared that would have sort of required, I think, removal. But that's not what I wanted, but it was my reality, and,
Right.
and so, yeah.
Well, and I was always the one, Danielle, and I was always the one that was being asked to leave the courtroom because I was the one that would give that pushback. And how many times I was in front of a judge that I wrote a petition for a child to go into kinship kind of home. Well, the mom hasn't had a CPS report in 5 weeks, so they're going to go back. And just the reaction that I had in this young man saying, I'm going back in the pit and this is what's going to happen to me. And sure enough, that's what happened. And they are currently serving a sentence because they were taken back into that environment, that situation that was horrifying to begin with. And just how it just rocks you as a person to see this. And I remember not gracefully walking out of this courtroom. I was asked to leave after I told this judge that's right, just put him back in the, that's right. And as I was walking out, this young man had a tear coming down his face, as did I, because we thought for sure that they were going to be able to put him in an environment that was going to support him and just be wonderful. And it didn't happen. And it just,
But
those are the kind of things that stick, you know?
Yeah,
Just,
it also speaks to that isolation idea because, like, look, you know, this article is like, oh, da, 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 da. I don't want anyone to know anything about my family. Like, don't come in my house. Don't ask any questions. I don't want you to know. It's much easier for you not to know. Like, I don't want to answer questions to friends at work. Like, I share as little as possible. And for some of you know, I moved from New York 12 hours away, and it has been the most relief ever because, you know, I lived in my community in New York for 25 years and we were foster parents for 15 of those 25 years. So every time a new kid went to the high school, they were like, oh, it must be a Skelly, right? It became like a thing. And I hated it because I felt like everybody knew my business. And I would go places and when people were like, oh, she has plenty of money. I've heard people discuss my finances because she has all those kids. You know, she gets a check for them.
Yeah, but
You know, so that isolation, I mean, I relish in it now, like that nobody knows that. I share with very few people what we did because it's like, those are just questions I don't want to answer. It's things I don't want to get involved in. You know, we spend holiday, we don't do much for that exact reason because of this misunderstanding or having to explain a behavior or why my kid is wearing the same jeans for 3 days in a row because look, I'm happy she showers once a week. You know, like these are things that I don't have to justify with people, but the world seems to feel like they have a right to ask those questions.
and it's about, I'm going to use this word purposely, it's about ownership. Because I can tell you all of the things that you're mentioning from working in schools and being a school counselor and being a therapist. These are things that parents that don't have foster children are going through, right? And nobody's questioning them about those things. But
right.
You have a higher responsibility when you are a foster parent.
Well, I'm usually going to say you have a higher responsibility when your kids aren't the same color as you are.
Yeah,
Because,
absolutely.
you know, for us, we are very white, and the majority of the children we raised were less white than us, or all different races and colors.
Less white.
You know, all different things. Well, because we had some youth that presented as white,
Right.
you know, that in itself warrants these questions and things that I'm like, it's none of your freaking business. But
Well,
somehow
it's like what's wrong. It's an added what's wrong with you.
Mhm. Exactly.
But again, I go back to the same thing that I've touched about before is the stigma that's attached to not just youth in foster care, but the foster families that are, because I've heard that before too. And I have a wonderful friend that continues to foster and she continues to get that question. Oh, you're doing this because of the money. Like, but I want to be able to remove that stigma and not have youth in care and foster parents feel like they can't share what their life looks like because of that judgment that comes through, because that's part of this whole problem. It just intensifies that stigma and it intensifies all the other things that are attached to it. And I've talked earlier about how kids in foster care already have that blanket of guilt on them and shame because they're in foster care. They already have a blanket and shame on them because they don't have a family and they're in their fourth placement and they're in their fourth foster home. And then on top of it, when they're in the foster home, they're still got that stigma on there because they're in a foster home. Like, when does that end? And when does that stop?
Yeah, so I just wanted to also touch on a point. This idea that these foster parents are doing this because of the finance is something that is true at times, right? There are amazing foster parents out there. But from my personal experience, I've been in 3 different foster homes. There comes a point where some of the parents take being a foster parent as almost like a vocation, almost like right? They grab as many kids as they can. So there is semblance to that, right?
Absolutely.
And I love the idea of kind of pushing away from that. But when it becomes a point, right? Because a lot of these foster parents, when they take this kid in, that's the idea, right? I'm just taking this kid in. I'm not receiving a son. I'm not receiving a daughter, right? I'm just taking this kid in until at some point, and that's why there's so much turnover, right? Not only with caseworkers, but also foster parents, because they don't take this they take it lightly, right? So I think that's something else that we should talk about, right?
Yeah, there are two things here, right? So I find myself wanting to say, but I understand that it wasn't. There are those people that foster, and I think fostering is nice, especially if you do it right, right? It could be worthwhile.
Absolutely.
I didn't do that. I did foster because I had to, right? There was a period of time when they moved in, but my yes to initially having anybody move into my house was they were going to be adopted, right? And I know that that's not for everybody, right? And there was a part of me as I was listening, he's like, everybody should just adopt them. But I know that that's not what everybody does, right? Like Danielle and I do, and we're just the crazy people.
That's not to say that we didn't have youth that moved into our house. Like we were very traditional foster parents for a period of time. But the piece to that is that like the system they monetize it, right? Because it's like, oh, you can get trained and then you get a bigger check, or you can do this and this. So they monetize these children's lives. Not only that, they monetize these children's experiences. So if you've had a more difficult life experience, you're worth more money to those foster parents. Or if your resilience isn't the same or whatever it is. And that makes me crazy because the foster parents who do it for the check, in my experience, is the ones that check all the boxes. They're the foster parents who are not asking what happened to you. They're the ones that make sure you get to every school event. Oh, trust and believe you go to the dentist twice a year. Trust and believe you have all your immunizations. They know the date you had your eyes checked.
Mm-hmm.
And they are supported and continuing to do what they're doing because they're the good foster parents. But if your life is chaotic and you're taking the deep dive into some of this hard stuff and your kids are off the chain and getting suspended from school, well, maybe we need to think about maybe this isn't best for you.
Right.
So they don't even create an environment where parenting, even if it's temporary foster parenting, is parenting first. It's checking the boxes. It's being, it's being a good, responsible date keeper. It's not about parenting, because parenting is messy. Like whether it's biological children or your adopted children, to parent for a day, for a month, for a year is messy. And if you're not willing to accept that people are going to do it messy, then how do you ask them to be foster parents?
Well, that speaks.
Exporting them in being parents. They're exporting them in being, caseworkers by extension. I don't even know.
Right. Well, that really speaks to, I hate when people have the simple answers, right? Like, but in any case, there's not enough people wanting to foster, right? So you kind of have to sort of sometimes pick from what you have, right? Yeah. Or then what happens? Then you go to group homes, or you go, all of the things that are not sort of family based, and those are a whole other slew of lessons that people learn about survival and their identity when you can't be matched with a family.
Right. But then again, it goes back to that humanity, right? Like,
yes,
how we have an expectation for systemically for us to do it better. Well, parenting can only be done one way. It's just done. And, some people are not as skilled at it and some are more skilled at it, but that doesn't mean the outcome's any better. Like there are very skilled parents who raised serial killers. I mean, God forbid.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like one does not equate to the other, but somehow we equate to a good parent who checks all the boxes will raise a good child.
Right.
And then we can make a good ad to get more good parents to come in. It's just a cycle of perpetuation where we're not keeping it real.
Right.
And is not keeping it real and expectations are not keeping it real. We're not honest, and it goes to the watered down files or like, I'm only going to tell you the pieces about this kid that might make you agree to take him, because the real story might be more than you can handle. And then when it's more than you can handle, it's like, what the hell? What's wrong with you? Why couldn't you handle this?
Right.
Because you didn't give me a chance to make an honest decision.
Well, how come you couldn't handle this without any support?
Right.
It's like, how dare you be incompetent?
Right.
Right. And it comes down to almost, it almost objectifies the youth, right? It makes them a number on the wall, right? So one of the agencies that I used to work at, I actually was able to see like their not record, but like their track sheet almost. And that, first of all, completely cold, no emotion in there because they don't have in there, right? That's one. Second of all, most of the time, it's not good stuff, right? Like, yeah, if you graduated, it'll be on there, but most of the stuff that's going to be on there is negative stuff, right? So where it's much easier to just look at yourself as almost like a commodity, right? As almost something that's being, and it's going to sound very harsh, but almost something that's being sold off, right? Just pushed around. You're just another crate on that shipment, right? And that's the harsh reality of it, right?
The retail model.
Yes. Yeah.
Funny.
It is a harsh reality, Guillermo. It is a very harsh reality. And I think one of the things that's just so incredibly important through all of the process, just for me and just the way that I watched others in youth lives, just that authenticity was just so lost, and just meeting this child where they're at and trying to help them to sort it all out in the midst of all of the craziness and chaos and just be that person, that one. And I always say it, I say it so often, it only takes that one person sometimes to be able to, but it's just, it's awful and it's sad. And it is a harsh reality of only reading those negative, awful things. And, over the years and some of the youth that I had in residential care that were there for 3 years, and you get to know these humans and these children of who they really, really are. And they're incredible. And I would always make sure that I'm like, these are going in this report and this is what's happening, because there's such a great side to this. To have somebody else dictate who you are, what you are, how you behave, and have that be your little resume, right? And it is harsh. It's very harsh.
It gets even deeper, right? Because when we actually look at these reports, right, look at how, and when it comes to placing it, right, it's so much deeper, because once you are labeled as the bad kid, right? Personally, I was one of those, bad kids. You're not even thought of when it comes to foster homes. Oh, we have to move the kid? Let's find another group home. I moved from, it was 4 different group homes that I went in when I first got into foster care. And it's funny because the only reason I actually was able to go into a foster home was because I had to have safety transfer. So, my safety was at risk. So they had to move me as soon as possible, but they couldn't find a group home. It wasn't until there was literal, just upfront, obvious danger that showed up at the doorstep of the group home, where they were like, crap, we got to move this kid. And they moved me into a group home, right? That was when I got my shift. Right. That was the moment when
they moved you into a foster home.
Oh, foster home. Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
It was this amazing little Dominican woman, Maria Diaz. And she not only did she show me maternal support, she showed me what a mother should be, but she also showed me there's another way. Right. And that's why I always spout this. And, I do believe that it just takes that one person. I think somebody touched it had already said that, but yeah, it just takes that one person, because honestly, to be completely candid, if I wasn't accidentally put into a foster home, I don't think I'd be here today. I don't think I'd be this vibrant young mind. I think I would honestly just be arrested or dead, and that's reality. I'm not
Statistically, that is true. I mean, the
Right.
statistics say that is very accurate.
Very accurate.
But it's
And I can list all of the youth that I worked with that are just that, either in jail, dead,
Yep. Yeah.
aged out of
it's a shame when you won't even try, and accidentally it works out. Oh, why didn't we think about this? That's accidentally placed in a home.
And the other piece for me is that, like, nobody, I'm sure, on your team said, well, what did Maria Diaz do different?
So they
Why
actually
did it work? Right? Because that's the sauce, right? That's the
Right.
sauce. Is what did she do different? This kid who couldn't go anywhere but in a group home, somehow this little Dominican lady found the sauce. So what's the sauce?
Right.
it's funny too, because honestly, they weren't thinking that.
No.
No, of course not.
Came in here, my caseworker, saying, "Hey, you ready? Like we finally found the group home for you." It was only after I basically told Maria, I almost called her mother. That's how much of just an amazing woman she is.
Mhm.
Where I told her, I was like, "Hey, because she only spoke Spanish." So I translated. I said, "Hey, they're taking me away." And she basically looked at me and she was like, "They're bringing you back to like," because I told her why I got moved. I told her, because she was an amazing woman. We would just sit there and talk. And she goes, "They're bringing you back to the place where you almost got, And I said, "Yeah." And then she looks at me and she goes, "Do you want to stay here?" Oh my God, it broke me. It broke me. Oh my God. And
It's gonna break me too.
I know. Why are you going there? Come on now, people.
sorry. That was it because it's scary. Yeah. It wasn't a thought on their mind, but the scariest thing about it is that it was never a thought on mine. I never thought, hey, this person might want me. I think that's what really, really did it for me. Because most of foster care did not work. That's why you're in there. But her saying, "Hey, do you want us that?" God, sorry guys, but
Sorry, it's all that's fine.
Yeah, thanks,
I think we're
Guillermo.
I'm so sorry.
And the big difference with Maria, and I'm going to throw this out here because I am such a big, was that human connection.
Right.
That human connection. And that was all that it took,
Yeah.
was that one person and that human connection to have that shift.
And you talk about it being one person. Sometimes it's just one act, because
Right.
I had a young woman who lived with me for a long time, and then she moved on for lots of different reasons. She was probably out of my house 5 or 6 years, and she calls and says, "I'm in the neighborhood and I really need my birth certificate. Can I come by and get it?" And that's something like I'm a stickler for. Like whenever the agency would give birth certificates, I'd be like, just give me a copy. And I would always hang on to it. And I had this binder of everybody's birth certificates.
Right.
Yeah, and I always used to say, like, no matter where you are, call me. I'll always have like your graduation, your birth certificate. I always kept things like when they got their IDs, I made a photocopy. Like it was just something that I knew. Because the truth is that me as an adult, I didn't have my birth certificate until like I had to get married. And I called my mom and I was like, "Hey, you got my birth certificate?" She's like, "Yeah, it's put up." So that's something I internalized. Like that's a mom's job, right? Is to like keep your birth certificate on some level. And she came to the house and I remember she's going, "Do you know where it is?" And I said, "We just got to find this binder." And it says kids not living in the house. Like that's how I labeled the binder. Right. So like if they moved out, I would just add them into this thing. Right. And we found it. And I remember her going through it. And I think one of my biological kids had moved out, so they got moved into kids not living in the house, which makes perfect sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, your kid is in here. And I'm like, well, they're not living in the house. So they moved into the kids not living in the house. And she was like so shocked by the idea that like her birth certificate and my biological kid's birth certificate were like in the same binder of kids not living in the house. And I was like, well, y'all are just kids not living in the house. Like,
Right.
I would look, you know? But it goes to the simplicity of when Maria Diaz asked you, do you want to stay? It's like, so like, no, you're just a kid who once lived in the house, who now doesn't live in the house anymore. Like your birth certificate stays there. Like
Right.
that was not striking to me.
Right.
But I remember years later having a conversation with her and she's like, you don't even understand. Like, she goes, I couldn't even tell you on that day because she's like, I got in my car and I was sobbing because she's like, I was just a kid who didn't live in the house. And I was like, yeah. And to me, I was like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Like, I'm just have a terrible filing system, you know?
It goes back to that normalcy. Like the
Right.
the other one saying she yells at me just like everybody else.
Yeah. And it's just this concept of like, it was so simple for this woman to just say,
Yeah.
well, do you want to stay?
Mm.
You know, and that you had value and that you mattered and that she was worried that if you weren't in her house, she couldn't keep you safe. Like,
Right.
Oh my God, yes, that's another point of it, right? Because one thing that I so personally I've experienced, I know a lot of my friends in foster care experience it as well, is that not only are we self-deprecating, but we're also self-destructive, right? It becomes a point where it's like, well, nobody cares if I'm safe, so F it. Let me just do whatever I want. I mean, myself, because there is that little semblance in the back of your mind, like maybe if I hurt myself enough, like somebody's gonna come and help,
Right.
right? But when nobody is there to actually pick you up, you fall into this this cycle of just hurting yourself again and again, right? And the moment she said, you know, like, do you want to stay? That was the moment where I was like, oh crap, someone cares, right? So someone cares if I don't come home.
Mm.
That, you know, I mean, come on, because
Come on.
yeah.
it's something that a lot of us take for granted, right? That having that person at home that wants us to come home every day. When you come home to a group home, what do you get? You get basically, first thing that you get is a metal detector all over your body. I mean, like, it's not the most welcoming thing, right? But yeah, that's why I'm not gonna lie. She got Maria Diaz, you know, an angel. She an angel.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. I remember I had an 18-year-old young woman and she was grounded because she had screwed something up. So I grounded her. And I remember her talking to her friends on the phone, like laughing hysterically about the fact she's like, no, I can't come out tonight. I'm grounded. And she's like, and she was like laughing. And I was like so insulted that she wasn't taking me seriously. I mean, she stayed, she was grounded, but like just the concept that someone would take the time to ground her. But she was having, like, she was calling people, like telling them how funny it was like that I grounded her. And I was like, and if you leave, I'm going to ground you more. And she was like, what? And I'm like, yeah, you'll just be grounded longer. And she was like, she couldn't even understand that concept, right? And that it became like a joke. They're like, oh, what are you going to ground me? I'm like, yes, I actually am. I'm going to ground you, you know? But it's these very simple, humane, just treating them like, treating you like a human being, that like your feelings and thoughts and existence
Matter.
Mm. You know, to me, that's the, you know, I go back to the video of like this idea of the sands not shifting. It's really just like someone saying, hey, you matter enough to like, let's contain the sand so it doesn't move. Right? It still might just be sand, but we put some like retaining walls around it so it doesn't move quite as much.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, you know, I mean, it seems so simple, but somehow kids every day, the majority of kids in care are failed by a system that can't figure out the retaining walls.
You've been listening to Out of the Starting Blocks and Into the Race. We
We want to thank you for joining us, and we want to thank our guests for helping us out today. Check out joetools.com and look for your opportunity to have a voice in our backstage discussions where we continue to discuss our important topics. Remember to look for updates at joetools.com where you can book a speaking engagement and get in touch with the hosts.